The more it develops, and it is going to develop more and more, the more unrest we're going to see. There's only so much I think the people can take. I would go far as to predict not just civil unrest, but civil war in the UK in the coming years. I would hate to be right on this, but I believe that I know there is no political solution.
Colonel Kemp, thank you very much for sitting down. As I mentioned off air, you get consulted a lot on the supranational threats that we face, a lot on Iran, China, Hamas and Israel's war, possibly Russia, but Vice President Vance recently has been giving some unwanted but necessary warnings to Europe and the UK that we are watering the seeds of our own destruction. So what threats do you think the West faces from within, not just without?
Well, I wouldn't describe Vice President Vance's warnings as unwanted. I think it's really important that we see a different perspective, perspective from outside. Sometimes a more realistic perspective can be seen by somebody who's not right involved in the situation. So I think anyone who would reject his kind of commentary, I think, is very narrow-minded and short-sighted as well. But the primary face, I think, apart from external threats from different countries around the world, the primary threat we face is from an alliance effectively of the hard left and Islamist extremists who have kind of, together with various other causes, have come together in a way to threaten the cohesion and the culture, in many ways, the entire culture and political existence of the West, not just the UK, but the whole of the Western world. And their primary kind of rallying point for that at the moment is Gaza. And that's not because they particularly care about Gaza. I'm sure that most of them don't care anything about Gaza.
Many don't know from which river to which sea, for example.
No, I've spoken to many people and asked them about that very subject, and they don't have a clue. And if you talk, I've spoken to students about what they mean by when they talk about Israel committing genocide, and they don't know what genocide means. They say, "Oh, it means Israeli soldiers killing Hamas or whatever." You can't explain. They don't understand it. They don't care about it. If they cared about, let's say, about Muslims being killed, or just ordinary people dying around the world, they would focus on far more deadly conflicts than we see in Gaza. But Gaza is the rallying point, the anti-Western rallying point, and those people who want to see Palestine freed from the river to the sea, as they put it, what they really mean is they want the downfall of the West, and they work to that end. And I think that's our primary threat that we face today. And it's not just about protests on the streets. It's far more insidious than that. And the whole agenda has infiltrated our universities, our international institutes that affect the UK, like the United Nations, etc., the EU, and our pretty much our entire system of government and national institutions like schools. All of these areas have been infiltrated by this movement over many years. And the important thing to remember, I think, is that this is not just a spontaneous protest movement or political warfare campaign. This is fostered by, funded to a large extent, by our international enemies like Russia, China, Iran, and other countries as well. So
I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were head of Cobra for a little while, and I won't ask you to violate the Official Secrets Act, but I, as a layman, just sort of reporting on these things from the outside, I scratch my head when the problem seems so obvious. Palestine is the omnicause for an alliance of co-belligerents between eco-zealots, communists, and Islamists who are using them as useful idiots. And lots of those Islamist groups are ostensibly idea laundries for the Muslim Brotherhood. Back in 2015, there was a report saying that the likes of the Muslim Council of Britain, the Muslim Association of Britain, had been in some part co-founded by the Muslim Brotherhood. But the Cameron government always shied away from just banning them outright, as lots of even Muslim countries have done, like Jordan and Egypt and the Emiratis. Why have governments been not only so reluctant to take action against the enemies that we know exist and have an undue influence, over our politics, but also seem to add a lot of demographic and thereby democratic fodder to this by importing people who have a lot of sympathies with jihadist groups from around the world.
I think our political leaders, and I'm not just talking about Starmer today or Cameron or Johnson or any of the others in recent years, are in a state of bewilderment. They're like rabbits in the headlight, if you know what I mean. And it's not that they don't understand the problem and the threat that we face, because they do. And when I was, as you mentioned, I was involved with Cobra. I was the head of the International Terrorism Intelligence Team for the Joint Intelligence Committee, the UK's top-level intelligence organisation. And I was involved in briefing Prime Ministers and Cabinet Ministers on these threats. They understand them fully, but the problem is that they don't know what to do about it. They really don't. And I think for most politicians, not being critical of any specific politician, but for most politicians, their horizon is 4 years. They want to keep a state of equilibrium for that time. They want to do what they can to make sure they win the next election. They don't want to take the kind of radical action that might be necessary to address these sort of problems. They really don't want to do that. And the other consideration they have is that, and particularly with Keir Starmer today, is that the Labour Party is so reliant on the hard left and on the extreme Islamist elements within his electorate, and there are many of them. And when I say extreme, I'm not talking necessarily about people who want to carry out terrorism, but people who want to drive the Islamist agenda through British society. And Starmer depends so heavily on them. And what can he do about it? The way he sees of dealing with it is to appease them. And really, the Starmer Labour Party is the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party. It hasn't changed. It's got a new coat of paint. Starmer, who tried to get Corbyn elected Prime Minister when he was on Corbyn's front bench, pretends that it's a different party today. It isn't a different party, it's the same party, with pretty much the same agendas behind it, fundamental agendas behind it among its supporters. And the last thing he can afford to do, given the other political pressures on him today, not only with the economy, with the need, for example, to significantly boost defence expenditure under pressure from Donald Trump, but also the political attacks he's receiving from Reform, and indeed will no doubt receive from Corbyn's new party. All he can see as the way ahead is to appease the more extreme elements of his party. And that's why, for example, he, rather than deciding to give his full support to Israel, which is fighting an unavoidable defensive war for its own survival, rather than supporting an ally on which we depend and which we owe so much to in so many different ways, including on defence, intelligence, etc. Rather than supporting them, he is turned against them. And he's turned against, his announcements that he's going to support a Palestinian state or recognise a Palestinian state, and all of this, which is so damaging. It's not so much damaging to Israel, but it's damaging to it's damaging to Israel in the sense that it encourages and it kind of hardens Hamas's position and Israel's enemies' positions. And he's not doing that because he doesn't understand the reality of what's going on in Israel. He does. I can guarantee he understands that. He gets intelligence briefings of the type that I used to give when I was working for his predecessors. He gets those briefings. He knows the reality, but what he wants to do is to placate the people who are causing trouble on his streets, the protesters, and the various other elements of British society that are anti-Israel. And so rather than his policy being based on genuine foreign policy considerations, they're based entirely on domestic policy considerations. And the same applies to Emmanuel Macron, for example, in France, and other world leaders.
Yeah, I think for those, especially among my generation, who are more concerned with domestic questions of identity and belonging than the economy or foreign policy, the Israel issue being the omnicause for the left we can look at it through the lens of, I have no doubt that lots of those protesters who are pro-Hamas would like to repeat October 7th in our country. So even if Israel seems like a distant land to you, it's still a concern that it's happening here. But considering they get these intelligence briefings and don't adjust on the fly, it sounds like a similar phenomenon that Dominic Cummings is describing, where politicians take on a sort of superposition personality, where they have to tell themselves polite ideological fictions to maintain the illusion of control. And this is accelerated by the fact they feel in a very precarious position because of the culturally and ethnically gerrymandered populace they preside over, and have to rely on groups like Muslim enclaves in our major cities as reliable voters. So they themselves feel under threat. Is that the reason you think that they can't adjust to these problems? And do you think that if there's not a political off-ramp to the domestic problems we face, do you agree with Professor David Betts's warnings that if there is no democratic solution, these things could build to civil unrest between the discontented natives who feel left behind and immigrant client groups who clash with them on ethnic lines?
Yeah, I've had that fear and concern for a very long time, because I know, I mean, I would hate to be right on this, but I believe that I know that there is no political solution to the situation Britain faces today. When I say there's no solution, I don't mean there actually isn't a solution, but there's no solution that any of our politicians are going to take, because for the reasons I mentioned before, they're afraid of doing anything significant that will cause upset among the, particularly their supporters, but the whole of the community as well. They're really afraid of that. And so they're not going to find a solution to this problem. They're not going to find a solution to illegal mass immigration into our country. They've made little effort to do so now. And I don't anticipate they will do so in the future. And the people in the country whose lives are being so dramatically affected by it, whether it be in Epping, where you've got an illegal immigrant settlement centre, for the want of a better word, in a hotel close to a school, and where there's certainly been allegations of sexual abuse against school children in Epping, and we've seen a degree of civil discontent there. And there are many other ways in which our community is being affected, for example, by huge pressure on school places, on hospitals, on NHS doctors, on civic services of all sorts, by a flood of both legal and illegal immigration. There's only so much I think the people can take of that. And they've been very, very quiet up until now. The people in the UK have not really raised their voices against this, or in a very limited way only. But the more it develops, and it is going to develop more and more, the more unrest we're going to see. And they have no option. And I'm not encouraging and I'm not kind of supporting this, but I think the people will feel they have no option other than to take action into their own hands, rather than rely on political leaders who are doing nothing in their eyes. So yeah, I think there's every likelihood. I don't know what the time frame is, but I would go far as to predict not just civil unrest, but civil war in the UK in the coming years, if this situation continues, which I believe it will.
Especially if they keep censoring them. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you, my pleasure.